People think they know Julian Assange, but his life is riddled with enigma and oddity, and the objective facts are harder to unravel, partly because of his own revisionism. For example, he disowned his own autobiography after he'd written it, but partly because the facts are so messy. Julian was born on the 3rd of July in 1971 in Townsville in the state of Queensland in Australia. This is a man who grew up unsettled on a pineapple farm, who spent his childhood exploring tunnels and playing out an Australian version of Tom Sawyer, probably complete with painting a fence in his imagination. His schooling was bizarre. He might blame his mother, who thought that a conventional education would be a handicap, and so he attended 37 different schools and then dropped out of university to concentrate on coding and WikiLeaks. And he got married at 18 and divorced. But there's a point at which you can't blame everything on your childhood. He first met his biological father, an unconventional architect, when he was 25. But it's John Shipton whom Assange credits with his rebel gene. Not the man Brett, whom his mother Christine married when Julian was 1 year old and who walked out when Julian was 10, or indeed the man that she took up with later, whom he called psychotic. Later, he got embroiled in a cult that was later exposed for sexual abuse and coercion, and escaping from that led to a life on the road with his mother as a teenager, fascinated by computers. It was that fascination that did for him. By the early 90s, he had a reputation as one of the best Australian hackers. He gave tips for phreaking in an underground magazine and discovered access to the US military secret defense system, Milnet. If you know the 1983 film War Games, Julian Assange was Matthew Broderick without the charm. He was charged with 25 counts of hacking, even if the judge concluded in the end that he was motivated by curiosity, not malice. Curiosity and arrogance, because he compared himself on trial to the great Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And oddness. He also brought flowers for the prosecution lawyer, and one of the lawyers pointed out, "She doesn't want to date you, Julian. She wants to put you in jail." I don't think he quite got the point. In the event, the court had mercy. So he brought up his son in Melbourne, wrote a book about his hacking experience, and later found solace in international counterculture groups and parties in Nigeria and Kenya. This is a story about freedom, free living, but also about the price that involves. It still costs money, it's still riddled with illusions of grandeur, and it's not hard to conclude that Julian Assange lived in some form of fantasy world. You don't have to be an amateur Freud to see why. He called himself a pig-headed activist intellectual, quite rightly. The hauteur, the naughtiness, the impulsive and reckless behaviour, the oddness, the brilliance, it's all there at the beginning. Assange founded WikiLeaks, initially with Shipton's name, his biological father's name, to publish the 2003 guidebook for the detention of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. The 238-page Army manual proved that the US kept prisoners from Red Cross inspectors and applied R21 techniques, that's torture techniques, to make them compliant under interrogation. But it took 4 years before in 2010 he released the material leaked by Bradley, later Chelsea Manning, the collateral murder footage that he hit the level of fame he seems to have been hankering after all his life. This shows a US helicopter attack in Iraq that killed several journalists, several unarmed civilians, including the 2 Reuters journalists. It's this video that defined WikiLeaks. A brilliant, driven man, arguably on the autism spectrum. Aren't all men, he's alleged to have said.
What the Guardian called with toggling eyes, wary of domesticity, easily angered, reckless with friends. His collaborators often walked out on him. And this was the man who was about to rocket to astonishing fame, and he was arguably ill-prepared.
So let's look at Bradley Manning. Another person caught up in this drama who did prison time, transitioned gender, and must be covered by the same judgments made a few days ago by Judge Ramona Manglona that there was no physical harm done at all by the WikiLeaks and the papers released were not top secret. Even if the leaks were embarrassing, and even if they arguably exposed a serious war crime by the US. Assange said of the video footage that Manning provided and that he expertly edited with footnotes and an accompanying quotation from George Orwell, if these airstrikes are right in acceding to the rules of engagement, then those rules are wrong. And by the time the footage was aired, the soldiers in the footage had been cleared of all wrongdoing. They had acted, said the US military, within the rules of engagement. And the footage makes very clear, and the voices on the footage make clear, that this was untrue. It was a lie, and what the footage shows is almost certainly a war crime by the US. The video is called It was taken by an Apache helicopter in Iraq on July the 12th, 2007. The helicopter is flying over Baghdad. It sees two Iraqis carrying cameras which were misidentified as weapons, and the pilot requests permission to fire. We have 5 to 6 individuals with AK-47s, we hear. And among the victims shot by the US from the helicopter was Saeed Shumar and Namir Noor al-Din, both Reuters journalists. And the footage shows their execution, and the voice from the helicopter repeatedly says, "Keep shooting." It's an unrelenting, and the vocal recording is an unrelenting, heartless document. And then a van appears, and the pilot requests permission to fire again. "Oh yeah," says the helicopter voice, right through the windshield. And when they realize in the helicopter that there are 2 children in the van, the voice says, well, it's their fault for bringing their kids to a battle. Just then, the US soldiers arrive on foot, including Ethan McCord, who has described the scene as a bad horror movie. And he locates the 2 wounded children, one is 4, one is 10, carries them to safety. Now, the video was published on April the 10th, 2010, and it was only then that the families and Ethan learnt the truth, hitherto suppressed by the US. In fact, Reuters had tried to access the footage and it had been denied. What WikiLeaks published gave the families and Reuters access to the truth. However unattractive, it was decrypted and published by Assange as an act of transparency. Now, sensational though it appears now, when it was first presented to Assange, it took time for Assange to realise what he had. He examined it and the documents that accompanied it in Reykjavik, in what Assange describes as the bunker, a place where characteristically his paranoia already in evidence. He had the curtains closed day and night. And the video was subtitled and edited there. The American media was apoplectic. Whoever leaked this is guilty of treason. Indeed, the second WikiLeak of 9,200 documents about activity in Afghanistan, the Afghan War Diary, and particularly about Pakistan's direct military links with the Taliban, arguably exposed individuals whose names were not redacted, and that was a problem. The Pentagon said WikiLeaks has blood on its hands, though there have never been reported incidents of any harm done since then because of that information. The New York Times called it an unvarnished and grim picture, and The Guardian agreed there was a public interest in the material being published. The newspapers who published the WikiLeaks material agreed not to publish the names or the more sensitive material, but WikiLeaks didn't take the same precautions, and putting those who helped the US and UK forces in danger. Not, however, so far removed to the later botched withdrawal from Afghanistan and Dominic Raab's sunbathing on the beach in Hania and the abandonment of hundreds of translators, the broken promises, and Afghan troops left even to this day to the mercy of the Taliban. The Guardian, the New York Times, and Der Spiegel, all of whom printed the Afghan files, confirmed the importance of WikiLeaks. That statement alone, I would argue, despite the indiscretion of the unredacted names, is testimony to the claims later made in court by Julian Assange that he was engaged in journalism. The publication of the names, however, the unredacted names, led to tensions even in the WikiLeaks organization itself. When Daniel Domscheit-Berg, the WikiLeaks spokesman, was irritated by the promises Assange had made to redact the names and his subsequent failure to do so. So, 7,600 pages were available, even if 15,000 documents were withheld. This was followed by the Iraq files, 400,000 classified files showing the atrocities of war, the torture of prisoners by the Iraqi security forces, proof of a greater number of civilian deaths, and Iranian support for Iraqi insurgents. In Assange's words, an extraordinary compendium of war. At the time, Assange said the Afghan leak provided victims with a sense of justice and it deters future error, except it didn't. And the Pentagon condemned WikiLeaks as a criminal organisation, so was it worth it? Well, there was Cablegate. Assange kept churning out the information, leaked mostly in November 2010, which completed a barrage of 251,000 cables that began trickling out in February, covering communication from 1966 through to 2010, exposing nuclear anxieties and, more particularly, personal, frank, candid, rude critiques by diplomats of foreign governments and individuals. That was probably more embarrassing than it was a security breach, but it was dramatic. The US said it put human rights activists and dissidents at risk. Hillary Clinton said there's nothing brave in opening up this information, on which our security depends. Was this in the public interest, or was this an act of provocation by Julian Assange? From this point, the US were openly calling for Assange's arrest. And on the 2nd of September 2011, Australia also pointed out that because an Australian intelligence officer had been explicitly named in one of the cables, a crime was potentially committed in Australia, something that has since been conveniently ignored or denied or forgotten by the Australian Prime Minister and senior Australian politicians who helped to secure Assange's release. The cables played a role beyond exposing the US. They played a role in the 2010 Tunisian revolt, or Jasmine Revolution, and therefore in the Arab Spring, which spread to Syria, leading to civil war in Syria, as well as the Yemeni crisis and civil war there too. In the summer of 2010, on a trip to Sweden, Julian Assange had consensual but unprotected sex with 2 women. Charges were made and then abandoned, then they were reinstated in what he called a highly irregular legal circus and a honey trap. It was one of a series of unwise moves by Julian Assange, but it was not out of character.
In 2006, he had described himself as 87% slut and a danger. Achtung! The Guardian called him a damaged personality with a peacock confidence, and even those most determined to prosecute him would look upon this story as a grey area. This story initially involves one woman, Anna Ardin, who has since written a book detailing her experiences with Julian Assange, setting out the case against him. Anna Ardin was a church deacon, and she says that Assange tricked her into having unprotected sex. He deliberately ripped a condom and broke her necklace. And this was while he was staying in her flat in Sweden. And he continued to stay in that flat, in her bed, sharing her bed for the next week. She later described it as the worst sex ever and violent. She went on to say that he refused to leave her flat and that he continued to make intimate advances towards her, roving the flat in a shirt and no trousers. In the course of the week, she learnt that another woman, Miss W, had had a similar experience, and the second woman claimed that she woke up to find Assange having sex with her. He told both women that he was too busy to have an HIV test. And it was while they were both trying to get their own HIV test that they approached the police. Miss W, meanwhile, had been advised by her friends that she could make a lot of money out of this story, allegedly. And Assange's defence team claimed that her accusation was a jealous response to finding out that he had had sex with Miss W. Assange and his lawyer, Mark Stevens, accused Anna of being a CIA honey trap. The honey trap had been sprung, and what we've seen so far, we can reasonably conclude, is only part of a greater plan, a political stunt. Anna says that as Sweden doesn't have the same comprehensive extradition treaties with the US that Britain has, ironically, Julian Assange would have been much safer to have gone to Sweden to answer these questions than to have stayed in the UK. The online abuse that she suffered as a result of all this meant that she fled to Spain. And the odd thing is the positive comments that she still makes about Julian Assange. She says, Julian is definitely not a monster, but he crossed my boundaries. He is in many ways a fantastic person. She also says that Assange refused to shower and left the loo unflushed, left turds floating in the toilet, and that consequently the flat smelt strongly of unwashed body, of dried sweat. He was imprisoned for a week in London, denying everything and bubbling with paranoia. At this time he met Geoffrey Robinson and lived under house arrest in his attic, explaining that he believed that extradition to Sweden would be the first step towards extradition to the United States, where he could face the death penalty. On the 25th of February, a judge ruled in favour of extradition to Sweden, and exhausting all other options, on the 19th of June he fled to the Ecuadorian embassy, and from then on was supported by Baltasar Garzón, a Spanish lawyer who coordinated his defence for nothing. Now, his supporters believe that the sexual abuse story in Sweden is part of an avalanche of mud slung at a freedom fighter in the hope that some of it would stick. Julian Assange stood at the window of the Ecuadorian embassy and said, as WikiLeaks stands under threat, so too does the freedom of expression. It questions investigative journalism. This is a vindictive persecution of freedom. And he called on the US to drop its witch hunt. Garzón explained that over the next few years in the embassy he was skateboarding. He had boarded up the windows with cardboard. He endured years without access to sunlight, to freedom, to medical care. And he was also visited by celebrities like Pamela Anderson and got married. But Stella Morris, another one of his lawyers representing him, said that the conditions under which he was being held were so oppressive that he was driven on occasion to consider taking his own life. The incarceration in the embassy didn't stop the WikiLeaks activity and the permanent police presence. Cost a huge amount of money, I think £10 million, to guard him, to protect him, to stop him moving. In 2015, a new WikiLeaks story about the US listening covertly to French presidents, all bugged by the NSA in a period of 12 years, was published in France. In the same year, in August, Sweden abandoned its primary case against him. And the following year, Assange publicly backed Trump rather than Clinton, who he called a well-connected sadistic sociopath. At the same time, copycat WikiLeaks groups made contact, and Assange's links to them and the suspicion that they might be Russian hackers emerges. The copycats were, during the presidential debates between Trump and Hillary Clinton, Trump appealed to Russia to find 30,000 lost emails, and reaching out on the 22nd of June, Assange
contacted a hacker called Guccifer 2.0, and that's the problem, about a stash of documents from Hillary Clinton to John Podesta. Send me any new material, says Assange, stolen from the Democratic National Convention here to us to publish. It will have much higher impact. And the leaks may well have shifted the debate over the election campaign, fingering Clinton as a security liability and undermining Bernie Sanders, both Democratic primary candidates in the 2016 election. It's not clear one way or the other whether this is why Clinton lost the election, but it didn't help her. Trump, however, once he took office, turned from saying, "I love WikiLeaks," to saying it was perplexing and deeply troubling. Call it out for what it is, a non-state hostile intelligence aided and abetted by state actors like Russia. And Mark Pompeo went after WikiLeaks. They champion nothing, he said, but their own celebrity, the destruction of Western values. And then there's Fortune. WikiLeaks made links to Fortune, and again Russian hackers were suspected, but Assange commanded the front page over hacked emails from the Macron campaign on the 5th of May 2017. Now, many of the documents in this tranche were demonstrably fake and simply designed to cause trouble. Why? Because the English manifestly has grammatical errors which are typical of Russian speakers of English. The links with Guccifer and 4chan suggest desperation, and they spoil Assange's record and reputation. They came at a time when, despite the Swedish courts finally dropping the rape charge, Julian Assange's paranoia was reaching a frenzy point, and with good reason. He was being monitored 24 hours a day, and footage from the embassy was being published in Spain. There was no privacy at all, and there were even cameras in the loo. In addition, the Ecuadorian government suspended the internet access, and in typical Assange fashion, the journalist turned on his only support for violating his fundamental rights and filed a case in the Ecuadorian courts, which was, of course, rejected. By 2018, the stakes were raised again, and he was officially accused by the US of espionage. In 2019, the new Ecuador President Lenin Moreno, who probably wanted a better relationship with the US, revoked the asylum, leading directly on April the 19th to Assange's arrest and the shocking footage of his being dragged out of the embassy. Jeremy Hunt said then, "Julian Assange is no hero. He is hidden from the law for years and years." Now, the British maintained their stance that their hands were tied by the extradition treaties and the international warrant. But when Julian Assange was finally released, nothing was done to tidy up those extradition details, and Assange walked away to the plane seemingly free. The extradition process was still technically in effect, so demonstrating that at any point, while Assange was being held in the UK, he could have been freed. And in 2020, the first extradition request was considered. But where was the hearing? The hearing was in Belmarsh prison, where Assange was told, Belmarsh prison, not in a proper court, in a prison. He was told he faced 175 years if convicted. There are parallels here, surely, with the prison hearings of Alexei Navalny in Russia. In prison, not in a proper court, in prison. And Julian Assange was convicted in November 2019 to 50 weeks in prison for violating his bail conditions and entering the Ecuadorian embassy. He served more than twice that time. Why? Assange faced 18 criminal charges from the US. Obtaining, that is hacking, a password for US Department of Defense computers, receiving and disclosing classified information, breaching the Espionage Act of 1970. Actually, He's accused of conspiring with Chelsea Manning, but this Espionage Act was an act targeted at American troops, even though Assange is an Australian. And arguably, while he was prosecuted for publishing this material, so too the Times published it, the Washington Post published it, the Guardian published it. Shouldn't they all have been published for the same thing? They were not. But it was Julian Assange alone who was singled out as a discredit to the US. He doesn't belong to the US. On January the 4th, 2021, the Supreme Court refused extradition because of Assange's mental health. The US planned to appeal, but the extradition process exposed the US case as essentially politically motivated and weak. Now, after the government changed in Australia, politicians in Australia began campaigning and lobbying for the US to drop the charges. Accordingly, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, was the first to meet Assange when he landed in Australia after a brief trip to plead guilty in a plea bargain on the American island territory of Saipan. "Nothing is to be served," said Anthony Albanese. "Nothing is to be served by his ongoing incarceration." The irony here is that on the day Assange was released, the American journalist Evan Gershkovich was taken to court in Russia to be charged with espionage behind closed doors. Now, when contrasted to Evan Gershkovich or Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe or other abuses of legal practice in Russia, Iran and elsewhere, the incarceration of Boris Kargalitsky, for example, the threats to Arundhati Roy by Modi in India, if Assange is now free, then the continued persecution and imprisonment of these people also needs to be flagged up. The incarceration of Assange is remarkable, especially when the US judge claims he did no harm as she accepted his plea in Saipan. But we cannot be morally righteous about one injustice and ignore the other. If Gershkovich's incarceration or Navalny's incarceration is wrong, which it is, then so too is the incarceration and silencing of Assange. More than that, Albanese presents himself as the saviour of freedom in this drama, while David McBride remains in a high-security prison in Australia for exposing the Australian massacre of Afghans, something a royal commission found to have been true. The commission found the military guilty, and yet McBride remains in prison. He remains behind bars. Assange was certainly helped by the Australian Prime Minister, Albanese, but also by Caroline Kennedy, an American, the US ambassador to Australia and JFK's daughter. But his plea bargain still leaves a worrying precedent, that foreign citizens are not covered by the First Amendment defence. This is something the Supreme Court in the UK didn't agree with. But they didn't release Assange from Belmarsh prison, where he was held for 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. He was not a citizen of the US. He was never charged in the UK. He had not committed an offence in Australia. On the island in the Pacific, in Saipan, the judge says he did no harm. This contradicts all the stuff put out by the US originally, how he put soldiers, civilians, translators, spies at risk. It is this allegation that he was a danger that has dogged the last 14 years of his life, and this question was settled last week in the sleepy island of Saipan when he pleaded guilty to espionage before Judge Ramona Manglona, who said, according to his lawyer Geoffrey Robinson on Radio 4 in the UK, he had put no one in physical harm. The documents he released were not top secret. They were available to 2 million American servicemen and to one who was confused about his sexual identity and was the source of the leaks. The morality of the 12 years without freedom for a crime committed outside the US by a non-US citizen is very hard to explain in democratic terms. It's hard to understand how the only way he can have secured his freedom is by willingly consenting to a criminal record, offering to the judge his elocution, his expression of remorse and guilt for a crime he never committed. It sets a worrying precedent for press freedom. Whether you think Julian Assange is a real journalist or not, indeed Julian Assange caused embarrassment, and he was probably also directly used, whether he knew it or not, by Russian intelligence. But none of that justifies his years of imprisonment in Britain. And it's the worrying response to Assange which is troubling, because it sets a precedent for state suppression of journalism. And his plea bargain justifies the US suppression of dissent, criticism and questioning. It raises questions about what can legitimately be reported about Ukraine or Gaza. Rather than opening up debate, in other words, the WikiLeaks saga has potentially led to the closing down of discussion and the suppression of freedom. That is what Julian Assange has given us.